Imagine standing in a freezing, foggy forest in 8th century Germany.
Okay, setting the scene. Cold, tense.
Very tense. You're surrounded by this heavily armed Germanic tribe, and right in the center of the clearing is this massive ancient tree.
The donor oak.
Exactly, the sacred donor oak. It's dedicated to the thunder god, Thor. And the locals absolutely believe that if anyone even scratches this tree, Thor is going to strike them down with a bolt of lightning.
Instant vaporization.
Right. So then a rogue missionary named Boniface walks right up to the trunk.
Oh, man.
Yeah, he pulls out a massive axe and just starts hacking away at it.
It's just an incredibly tense historical moment. I mean, everyone is just waiting for the sky to open up.
Exactly. But, the sky stays quiet. Nothing happens. The tree eventually groans, splinters, and just crashes to the forest floor.
And Boniface is just standing there.
Yeah, he drops the axe, turns to this completely terrified crowd, and basically says, "So, about my god."
That is wild.
And the tribe is so stunned by Thor's silence that they just convert on the spot. Human history in Europe basically shifts in an afternoon.
Just an incredible pivot point.
But here's the question that really drives our deep dive today for you, the listener. Was that actually the mission of God, or was it just a really dramatic, highly effective piece of, human theater?
That's the perfect tension to start with, because it perfectly captures that massive gap between theory and practice.
Right. It's like, think about a grand architectural achievement, like a towering skyscraper, right? When you look at the blueprints, there is this expectation of absolute precision. The lines are perfectly crisp. The math is flawless. Every stress load is calculated.
Right. The architect points to the schematics and says, there it is, perfect.
Exactly. It's completely binary on paper.
It either works mathematically or it doesn't. It's clean.
Yeah.
And honestly, it's comforting. We really like things to be perfectly categorized.
We do. But then you actually step onto the construction site, and suddenly that pristine blueprint just collides with reality.
Oh, yeah. You're looking at a landscape that's muddy and chaotic.
There are shouting contractors, supply chain delays. Someone put the plumbing in backwards, and the weather is actively working against you.
It's the perfect design colliding with the deeply imperfect reality of human execution.
And that collision is exactly what we're going to explore today in this deep dive. Our mission for you is to explore the incredibly fascinating intersection of divine theology and really messy human history.
We have two monumental sources today to guide us through this.
Right. First, we have Christopher J.H. Wright's massive theological masterwork, The Mission of God, which basically gives us the ultimate, holistic, perfect blueprint.
And second, we have Ruth A. Tucker's sweeping biographical history, From Jerusalem to Aryan Jaya,
which documents the eccentric, deeply flawed, and painfully ordinary human beings who actually tried to build that blueprint across 2 millennia.
It really is the story of how a perfect plan survives, being built by highly imperfect contractors.
So to really grasp the scale of this blueprint, we have to start with a foundational concept from Wright's book.
Yeah, he builds his entire framework around this idea of the Missio Dei.
That's Latin, right?
Yes, Latin for the mission of God. Now, typically when we hear the word mission, we think of it as an activity.
Like something the church does.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We have mission committees, mission trips, mission statements on corporate websites. But Wright argues that mission isn't just an activity. Mission is an actual attribute of God himself.
Wait, let me stop you there, because that's a pretty massive paradigm shift.
It really is.
You're saying the mission belongs to God first. Like, we don't own it. The church doesn't generate it.
That's the core of it, yeah. God doesn't just send people on missions. God is a missionary God by his very nature.
So he has a church for his mission in the world, not a mission for his church.
Precisely. Wright points out that the term Missio Dei originated with theologians who were connecting mission to the doctrine of the Trinity.
Oh, interesting. How so?
Well, think about the biblical narrative. You have the Father sending the Son, then the Father and Son sending the Spirit.
Right.
So mission is grounded in the very movement of God through history. Our human involvement is just a participation in that prior, much larger reality.
So all human mission flows from God's mission to redeem his whole creation.
Exactly.
Okay, so if God is the one driving the mission, how does that change the way we read our sources? Wright talks a lot about reading the Bible with a missional hermeneutic.
Yes, he does.
Now, hermeneutic is one of those heavy seminary words that usually makes my eyes glaze over, but as I understand it, it basically means the lens through which you interpret a text, right?
Spot on. A hermeneutic is simply your framework for interpretation. And Wright argues that the Bible itself is a product of God's mission.
So we shouldn't just read the Bible looking for a few isolated verses that say, go preach to people.
Right, like it's just a specific task appended to the end of the book.
Yeah.
Wright says no. From Genesis to Revelation, the entire text is the grand narrative of God working to bless all nations.
And redeem all of creation. It's a sprawling, unified story.
It really is. And he traces the real kickoff of this blueprint back to Genesis chapter 12 with the Abrahamic promise.
Okay, the story of Abraham. God tells him to leave his country and go to a new land.
Yes, but look at the why. God promises to bless Abraham, but with a very specific universal goal attached to it.
And all peoples on earth will be blessed through you.
That right there is the blueprint. Blessed to be a blessing to the nations.
Wow, so the particular choice of one man was for the universal salvation of the world.
Exactly.
So we take that blueprint from Genesis, and we fast forward thousands of years to the New Testament, and we see the early church picking up this exact same plan. Let's look at the Apostle Paul. Tucker's history highlights Paul as the prototype missionary.
The ultimate contractor, if we're using your analogy.
Right. But what's really striking when you read her historical breakdown is that Paul wasn't just walking around acting like an individual savior.
He wasn't just trying to snatch individual souls out of a fire.
Exactly. He was actively planting multi-ethnic covenant communities.
Which was completely radical at the time. I mean, he was bringing Jews and Gentiles together in the same room.
Sharing the same meals.
In the socio-political climate of the first century Roman Empire, that was culturally explosive.
But he did it because he was trying to reflect that universal blessing God promised to Abraham.
He really embodied Wright's idea that the church is the agent of God's ultimate intention. Paul wasn't just trying to change individual minds.
He was creating a totally new social reality.
Yes. And Tucker gives us the historical grit of how he actually pulled that off. He didn't just wander aimlessly.
Right. He targeted highly strategic, cosmopolitan urban centers, Ephesus, Corinth, Rome.
And he engaged in bivocational tent making. He worked a manual labor job.
The tent making is such a fascinating detail.
It really is. Often we think he just did that to pay the bills so he wouldn't be a financial burden on these young churches.
Which is true, but historically it did something much more important.
Working in the agora, the marketplace, embedded him in the artisan class. It plugged him directly into the gossip networks.
The trade routes, the daily life of the city.
It allowed him to move freely and identify with the working classes. He was really operationalizing the theology of the Missio Dei in the bustling, diverse cities of the empire.
But Tucker doesn't just focus on the heavy hitters like Paul. She brings in these incredible, visceral stories of early Christians.
People who carried this mission forward in ways that completely broke the societal mold of their day.
Let's look at Perpetua in Carthage, North Africa, around the year 203. Have you read her prison diary?
I have, and it's one of the most remarkable documents from antiquity. It's actually one of the earliest surviving texts written by a Christian woman.
It's so intense. She's this young, noble woman, 22 years old, and a nursing mother, and she's imprisoned for her faith.
And the Roman authorities didn't actually want to kill her.
Right. They just wanted her to sprinkle a little incense to the emperor to maintain public order. Just a formality.
Yeah. But she refuses. Her father, who had absolute legal power over her under Roman law, the Patria Potestas, comes to the prison.
And he begs her, physically weeping, kissing her hands, pleading with her to just recant and save her life and her baby's life.
It's agonizing to read.
It is. But she stands firm. She's eventually martyred in the arena, torn apart by wild beasts.
It's a brutal story. But analytically, what does Perpetua's story prove about the blueprint?
It proves that the mission extended radically across social classes and genders in a way that just defied Roman logic.
In that world, a noblewoman had a strictly defined private role. Obedience to the father was paramount.
But the gospel empowered her to make a public, fatal stand. And she didn't face the beasts alone, did she?
No, she faced them holding hands with her slave Felicitas, who had also just given birth in the prison.
A Roman noblewoman and a slave treating each other as absolute equals in their final moments.
Precisely. The social barriers were completely obliterated by their shared participation in God's mission.
Their martyrdom wasn't just a tragic execution.
No, it was an incredibly potent form of witness. The Greek root of the word martyr literally means witness.
It showed the Roman world that this faith penetrated every layer of society.
And that it held a power that was stronger than the emperor's threat of death.
I want to try an analogy here to synthesize what Wright's theology and Tucker's history are telling us about this early church period.
Yeah, let's hear it.
Imagine you're a tenant renting an apartment. If you decide to completely gut the kitchen, tear down the drywall, and reroute the plumbing just because you feel like it.
You're going to get evicted or sued.
Exactly. You have zero authority. But if the landlord gives you a highly specific signed renovation plan and authorizes you to carry it out,
Suddenly you have immense authority.
right, you don't own the building, but you're authorized by the owner to change it. That's what I see in Paul and Perpetua.
They realized they didn't own the house, meaning the world.
Yeah, they were simply tenants executing the property owner's grand renovation plan.
That's a great way to visualize it. The early Christians understood they were authorized agents,
Operating under the authority of the risen Christ.
who explicitly said, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me." Their mission was an authorized cooperation with the owner.
But that brings us to a really uncomfortable turning point in the history.
It always gets messy when power gets involved.
Exactly. If the early church understood the blueprint so well when they were persecuted tenants, hiding in catacombs and dying in arenas,
What happens to the blueprint when those tenants suddenly become the city planners?
right, what happens when Christianity gets political power?
That is the pivotal shift.
Yeah.
Once the Roman Emperor Constantine legalized Christianity in the 4th century, and it eventually became the state religion,
The methods of mission swung wildly.
Tucker shows us how the historical pendulum moves away from the organic community planting model of Paul,
And swings heavily toward what she calls baptizing the masses.
which is deeply intertwined with political and military expansion. We're talking about the medieval period now.
Right. And if we look at this through Wright's theological lens, we see massive friction.
Wright argues that the biblical blueprint, the Great Commission, isn't just about getting people wet in a baptismal font,
Jesus didn't say, go and baptize people. He said, go and make disciples.
teaching them to obey everything he commanded. It requires forming communities of deep covenantal obedience.
But in the medieval and early modern periods, you have figures like Francis Xavier.
The famous Jesuit missionary in the 16th century,
Yeah, he traveled across India and Japan, and he was incredibly zealous, enduring massive physical hardships, shipwrecks, disease.
but he recorded baptizing tens of thousands of people, sometimes thousands in a single day.
Wait, mechanically, how is that even possible if you're baptizing thousands of people in a day?
You barely have time to dunk them.
Let alone teach them the intricacies of a new faith.
You don't. Tucker points out that Xavier often didn't even know the local languages.
So how did he communicate?
He would rely on crude, phonetic translations of the Apostles' Creed or the Ten Commandments. He'd have the crowds recite them back and then baptize them.
The sheer volume makes it practically impossible that there was any deep, sustainable discipleship happening.
It is a rapid, surface-level expansion.
And it gets even more aggressive than that. Let's go back to our opening story with Boniface and the Donar Oak in the 8th century.
Ah, the apostle to the Germans.
He chops down the sacred tree. Thor doesn't strike him down. The people convert. It's a massive power encounter.
But when you look closely at Tucker's history, it's very top-down.
Boniface was operating with the explicit backing of Charles Martel, the ruler of the expanding Frankish kingdom.
The methodology of that era was highly pragmatic. Convert the chieftain, the tribal leader, or the king.
And the whole tribe follows by default.
It was a matter of political allegiance as much as, or sometimes more than, personal faith.
But hang on, let me play devil's advocate for a second.
Go for it.
It's really easy for us, sitting here in the 21st century with our modern ideas of individual choice, to judge a medieval guy like Boniface chopping down a tree.
Sure.
But wasn't he just doing exactly what Wright talks about in his theology? Wright spends whole chapters talking about how the living God inherently confronts the false gods and idols of the nations.
He does.
So wasn't Boniface just executing that part of the blueprint in the absolute only language an 8th century Germanic warrior tribe would understand?
A language of raw power.
Yeah.
That's a really short historical point. We have to be careful not to anachronistically judge the 8th century by modern standards.
Exactly.
For Boniface, chopping down that oak was a highly contextualized theological argument. It was a tangible, physical demonstration of his God's supremacy over local spirits.
And that is a deeply biblical theme, like Elijah calling down fire on Mount Carmel against the prophets of Baal.
Right. Absolutely affirms that confronting idolatry is necessary. However, Reich's ultimate point, where the theology critiques the history, is that confronting idolatry is only step one.
Right. There has to be a step two.
If chopping down the tree isn't followed by the long, slow work of forming a community characterized by ethical obedience to God.
If it just remains a nominal state-mandated allegiance because the chieftain said so,
then it falls short of the full biblical blueprint.
So the pendulum swung all the way to mass state-sponsored religion. But Tucker shows us that it eventually swings completely in the opposite direction.
Fast forward to the 18th century, and we meet the Protestant Moravians.
The Moravians are a fascinating counter-movement.
Under the leadership of Count Nicholas Ludwig von Zinzendorf, a wealthy German nobleman.
They swung entirely away from state-sponsored top-down conversions.
They focused on personal heart religion, deep emotion, and intense community.
Zinzendorf is such a wild historical figure. He basically turns his massive estate, called Herrnhut, into a refugee camp for persecuted religious minorities.
And it turned into this incredibly intense spiritual hothouse.
They started a 247 continuous prayer meeting that lasted for over 100 years.
Just people taking shifts around the clock.
And out of that prayer meeting, they started sending missionaries. But they didn't send ordained, highly educated theologians.
And they certainly didn't send armies. They sent lay people, carpenters, potters, farmers.
And their methodology was the exact inverse of the medieval approach.
Take Moravian missionaries like George Schmidt, who went to South Africa to work with the indigenous Khoi people.
Or Hans Jade, who went to the freezing, brutal environment of Greenland.
Jade originally went looking for lost colonies of Vikings, actually, but found the Inuit instead.
These Moravians didn't rely on political power or the backing of a king's army.
They lived among the people. They spent years agonizingly learning the complex local languages.
They supported themselves with manual labor, and they focused entirely on personal, individual conversion.
They modeled themselves as equals, or even servants, to the people they were reaching.
It's a beautiful model, but it also highlights this constant tension we see in Tucker's book.
The tension between saving an individual soul versus changing a whole society.
Between a quick mass baptism and deep ethical transformation. And that tension leads us directly into one of Christopher Wright's most critical theological concepts.
He argues that true mission isn't an either. It's a holistic mandate.
This is arguably the beating heart of Wright's entire massive book.
He insists that biblical redemption is utterly holistic. It's a word we throw around a lot, but he defines it rigorously.
He says redemption is not just about saving souls so they can evacuate to heaven when they die.
He uses the exodus of Israel from Egypt as his primary foundational model for what God considers redemption.
Okay, unpack the Exodus model for us. How does Moses leading people out of Egypt translate to a holistic mission?
Wright argues that the Exodus had 4 distinct, inseparable dimensions. First, it was political.
God liberated Israel from a tyrannical, oppressive regime.
Second, it was economic. He freed them from slave labor, where they didn't own the fruits of their work.
Third, it was social. He gave them the law to form them into a new, just community.
And fourth, it was spiritual. He called them to worship him instead of the gods of Egypt.
So Wright's point is that you can't separate those.
God didn't just forgive Israel's sins while leaving them making bricks in the mud. He redeemed their entire physical and social reality.
Therefore, true mission today must address the whole human condition.
It must apply the power of the cross to all the effects of sin and evil in the world.
Whether that's spiritual darkness, unjust laws, or systemic poverty.
Exactly. And he also ties this to the concept of Jubilee.
Can you explain what the Jubilee was for listeners who might not be deep into Levitical law?
The Jubilee was a law in ancient Israel where every 50 years there was a massive societal reset.
Debts were forgiven, Hebrew slaves were freed.
And most importantly, land that had been sold due to poverty was returned to its original family.
It was an economic mechanism built into the law to prevent permanent multi-generational poverty.
And massive wealth inequality. Wright uses Jubilee to show that God's mission deeply cares about economics and justice, not just private piety.
So let's look at how that holistic Exodus-style mandate actually played out in the mud of history.
Tucker gives us some phenomenal examples of missionaries who fought social evils tooth and nail.
Let's start in the 16th century with Bartolomé de las Casas.
He starts out as a Spanish colonist in the Americas.
He's actually a participant in the encomienda system.
We should define that because it's crucial to understanding his impact.
Right. The encomienda system was a brutal legal framework established by the Spanish crown.
Colonists were granted a certain number of indigenous people. The colonists was supposed to protect them and teach them the Catholic faith.
But in reality, it was a system of forced labor, essentially slavery.
The indigenous people were worked to death in mines and on plantations.
And Las Casas is part of this system. He owns an encomienda.
But he has this profound moral awakening while reading a passage in the book of Sirach.
About how offering a sacrifice from the property of the poor is like murdering your neighbor.
He repents, gives up his slaves, becomes a Dominican priest, and spends the rest of his life relentlessly defending the indigenous populations against the Spanish Empire.
Las Casas is a perfect historical embodiment of the political and economic dimensions of Wright's Exodus model.
He realized you cannot claim to be bringing the spiritual redemption of Christ while simultaneously perpetuating the economic and political enslavement of Pharaoh.
He recognized that the gospel demands justice.
He crossed the Atlantic over a dozen times to lobby the Spanish court. He wrote scathing, graphic accounts of the destruction of the Indies, exposing the torture and genocide.
And his advocacy was based entirely on his Christian convictions that these native peoples bore the image of God.
We see that same holistic drive much later in the late 19th century in Africa with Mary Slessor.
She was a Scottish missionary who went to the Okuyong district in what is now Nigeria.
She was a tough, working-class mill worker from Dundee.
And she didn't stay in the safe, comfortable coastal missionary compounds. She pushed deep into the interior jungle.
And there, she confronted a horrific cultural practice, the killing of newborn twins.
The mechanics of that cultural belief are important to understand.
The local tribes believed that twins were the result of a woman mating with an evil spirit.
So the babies were viewed as cursed, a danger to the whole community.
The mother was often violently exiled from the village, and the infants were thrown into the bush to die of exposure or be eaten by wild animals.
Slessor aggressively fought this practice. She didn't just preach against it.
She physically intervened. She would run into the jungle, rescue these abandoned babies, and raise them herself in her own compound.
She eventually adopted over a dozen children.
And her influence and respect grew so much that the British government actually appointed her as a vice-consul, a white chief in the region, to mediate disputes and administer justice.
She was addressing the social and spiritual dimensions simultaneously.
She was bringing the protective, life-affirming ethics of the kingdom of God into a socio-cultural space where fear and death were the ruling mechanisms.
She was liberating women from exile and saving children's lives, viewing that as an integral part of her missionary calling.
And then there's Gladys Aylward in China in the 1930s. Her story is wild.
She was a working-class British parlor maid.
She applied to a mission board, and they rejected her because she didn't have the educational background to learn Chinese.
So she spent her life savings on a train ticket across Soviet Russia and Siberia to get to China on her own.
She was tiny, less than 5 feet tall, and became known as the small woman.
But here's where the holistic part comes in. The local Chinese mandarin, the government official, actually hires her for a government job as a foot inspector.
Foot binding was an ancient, crippling practice where young girls' feet were tightly bound to prevent them from growing.
Breaking the bones to create a lotus foot, which was considered beautiful and a status symbol.
The new government had outlawed it, but they needed someone to enforce the law in the remote villages.
They needed a woman because a man couldn't inspect women's feet.
And they needed someone with unbound feet who could actually endure the physical travel between mountain villages. Aylward fit the bill perfectly.
So she takes the job, and she uses the authority of the government to physically unbind the feet of these little girls, saving them from a lifetime of disability and pain.
And while she's doing it, she's telling stories of Jesus to the village.
And later, when the Japanese invade China, she famously leads nearly 100 orphans on a harrowing, multi-week journey over war-torn mountains to safety.
Aylward beautifully illustrates Wright's argument that evangelism and social compassion are seamlessly integrated.
She didn't view inspecting feet or rescuing orphans from bombs as a distraction from preaching the gospel.
She viewed it as the gospel made flesh. She was confronting systemic physical harm and providing immediate physical salvation, all in the name of Christ.
So, hearing these stories of Las Casas, Slessor, and Aylward, I want to ask you, the listener, to consider something about our modern discourse.
This is a really important question.
Why is there so often a bitter divide today between evangelism on one side and social justice on the other?
We often treat them like competing political platforms.
One group says, just preach the gospel, don't get involved in politics or social issues.
The other group says, the gospel is entirely about fixing systemic injustice.
Why do we constantly try to chop the blueprint in half? when historical figures saw them as the exact same mission.
It's what Wright calls the tragedy of reductionism. When we reduce the gospel to only spiritual afterlife management, we lose the prophetic critique of unjust systems.
We end up ignoring the slave ships and the sweatshops.
But when we reduce it only to social activism, we lose the spiritual core of human repentance and the transformative power of the cross.
True mission holds them together. But here's the catch. To effectively challenge deeply ingrained social evils like foot binding or the killing of twins, you have to understand the culture deeply.
You can't just yell at people from the outside in English. You have to translate the message.
And that brings us to one of the most fraught, agonizing challenges in Tucker's entire history.
The fine line between contextualization and compromise.
Yes, translation. According to Wright's theology, God absolutely wills to be known among all the nations. He isn't a tribal deity.
But to be known, the message has to cross profound linguistic and cultural boundaries.
Wright points out that the early church actually settled this theological crisis very early on at the Jerusalem Council in Acts 15.
The early Jewish apostles had to decide, do these new non-Jewish believers, these Gentiles, have to adopt Jewish culture to follow Jesus?
Do they have to get circumcised and follow kosher dietary laws?
And the apostles decided no. The gospel could take root natively in Gentile culture.
That decision in Acts 15 is basically the theological permission slip for all future contextualization.
It proves that the gospel is universally translatable. It doesn't require specific cultural uniform.
However, Tucker's historical accounts show us how incredibly difficult it was for missionaries to figure out how to do that in practice.
It's a constant tightrope walk. You're trying to find common grace within a culture to use as a bridge,
while simultaneously confronting the actual idolatry or destructive practices of that culture.
And missionaries went to some wild extremes trying to walk that tightrope.
Let's look at Ulfilas in the 4th century. He was a bishop who translated the Bible for the Goths, a fierce Germanic tribe.
But he made a fascinating and highly controversial editorial decision. He deliberately left the books of Kings out of his translation.
Right. 1st and 2nd Kings, which chronicle the military history of ancient Israel.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Why did he leave them out?
Because the Goths were already an incredibly warlike culture. They loved battle.
And Ulfilas was terrified that if they read stories of ancient Israelites slaughtering their enemies with God's blessing, the Goths would just use the Bible to justify their own violent tendencies.
So he contextualized by omission. He censored the text.
Which raises massive ethical and theological questions about tampering with the source material.
It really does, but it shows you the acute anxiety missionaries felt about how their target audience would perceive the message.
Then you have Hudson Taylor in the 19th century. He founded the China Inland Mission.
Now, you have to understand the Victorian mindset of his peers. For most British missionaries at the time, British culture was Christian culture.
They wore heavy wool suits in the sweltering heat, lived in foreign compounds, and expected the Chinese to adopt Western ways.
Taylor realized this was a massive barrier. The Chinese viewed Westerners as foreign devils forcing opium and strange religions on them.
So Taylor shocked his colleagues by discarding his Western clothes completely. He adopted full Chinese dress.
He shaved the front of his head, grew a long pigtail down his back, the traditional queue, and dyed his remaining hair black.
His Victorian peers were absolutely scandalized. They thought he was degrading the dignity of an Englishman.
But Taylor grasped a profound missiological principle. The messenger should not be an alien distraction from the message.
He was trying to strip away the cultural imperialism so the Chinese could hear the actual gospel, not just a pitch for British civilization.
But the strategy of adopting local customs can go even deeper into the realm of philosophy.
Tucker talks about Matthew Ricci, a brilliant Jesuit missionary in the late 16th and early 17th centuries.
He took contextualization to the intellectual elite of the Ming dynasty in China.
He didn't just dress as a Buddhist monk initially, and later as a Confucian scholar. He used Western science to gain an audience.
He brought mechanical clocks, prisms, and advanced map-making to the emperor's court to earn their respect.
Ricci was a master of adaptation, but theologically, he went very far.
He presented Christianity as something inherently compatible with the highest moral ideals of ancient Confucian philosophy.
He argued that the Chinese practice of ancestor veneration honoring dead relatives was just a civic and familial duty, not idolatrous worship.
Therefore, Chinese converts could keep doing it.
But that sparked a massive fight back in Europe, didn't it?
The Chinese rites controversy.
Yes. Different Catholic orders, like the Dominicans and Franciscans, heavily criticized Ricci's Jesuit approach.
They argued he had accommodated too much to the point of syncretism.
Define syncretism for us.
Syncretism is when you blend two different religions or philosophies so deeply that the original core of the faith is lost or compromised.
Ricci's critics feared that he wasn't converting the Chinese to Christianity. He was converting Christianity into a sub-branch of Confucianism.
The Pope eventually condemned the Chinese rites, which severely damaged the mission's standing with the Chinese emperor.
It shows the perpetual danger of contextualization. Go too far, and you lose the message entirely.
But then you have a 20th century example that missiologists universally praise as a masterstroke.
Tucker highlights Don Richardson, who went to work among the Sawi tribe in the jungle of Irian Jaya in the 1960s.
The Sawi had a culture that idealized treachery and betrayal.
They would fatten up an enemy with friendship for months before turning on them and killing them.
So when Richardson finally learned the language well enough to tell the story of Jesus, it completely backfired.
When he got to the part where Judas Iscariot betrays Jesus with a kiss, the Sawi cheered.
They thought Judas was the ultimate hero of the story because he executed the perfect betrayal.
You can imagine the despair Richardson felt. How do you communicate a gospel of love and sacrifice to a culture that literally worships deceit?
But then he discovered a local custom. The Sawi were constantly engaged in brutal, revenge-driven tribal warfare.
The only way to stop the violence and establish a binding peace between two warring villages was an agonizing exchange.
A father from one village had to take his own infant child and give it to the enemy village.
As long as that peace child lived, the two tribes could not fight.
Richardson coined the term redemptive analogy. He used this exact custom, a concept they understood perfectly, to explain the gospel.
He told them that humanity was at war with God, and Jesus was God's ultimate peace child, given to us so we can have peace.
It's a stunning example of what right means when he says God can be known through the cultural forms of the nations.
And the theological concept Richardson was conveying is substitutionary atonement, the idea that Christ took our place and bore the cost to reconcile us to God.
Richardson found a pre-existing bridge in their own culture to explain that complex theology perfectly.
We see that same drive to bridge the gap linguistically with Cameron Townsend.
He was in Guatemala in the early 20th century trying to sell Spanish Bibles to the indigenous Kachagol Indians.
And one of them asked him a devastatingly simple question. If your God is so smart, hasn't he learned our language?
That single question haunted Townsend. It exposed the flaw in relying on trade languages like Spanish or English.
It sparked him to dedicate his life to linguistic translation, eventually creating Wycliffe Bible translators.
With the goal of translating the scriptures into the mother tongues of thousands of hidden people groups.
So hearing all these stories, from Ulfilas censoring the Bible to Taylor growing a pigtail, I have to ask you, where is the actual line?
How do you know when you've crossed from brilliant contextualization, like the Peace Child, into dangerous compromise, like what Ricci's critics accused him of?
It is the most heavily debated question in missiology. Wright would argue that true contextualization affirms the dignity of the culture while still allowing the biblical gospel to critique its core idolatries.
Richardson's Peace Child was a bridge that illuminated the cross. It didn't dilute the message of Jesus' sacrifice. It magnified it in a way the Sawi could finally grasp.
The line is crossed when the surrounding culture starts dictating the terms of the gospel, rather than the gospel redeeming the culture.
If you strip away the demand for repentance just to fit in, you've compromised.
But walking that line, moving into these harsh environments and learning these languages requires immense, agonizing sacrifice.
Which brings us to the profound human cost of this entire endeavor.
Yes, the cost. Christopher Wright asserts something very heavy in his theology.
He says that the cross was the unavoidable cost of God's mission. Jesus had to suffer and die to enact the blueprint.
It wasn't an accident, it was the mechanism.
And Tucker's history reveals that this theological cost is mirrored almost exactly in the physical, emotional, and psychological suffering of the missionaries themselves.
She makes a massive point in her preface, and honestly, it's one of the most refreshing things about her book.
She emphasizes that these missionaries were not super saints with glowing halos.
They were deeply flawed, ordinary, sometimes depressed, and highly eccentric people.
That is a vital historical corrective. In church history, we have a terrible habit of putting these figures on stained glass windows.
We sanitize their biographies, we remove their humanity to make them inspiring.
But Wright's theology of the cross dictates that God's mission is lived out historically through weakness, through failure, and through suffering.
The history of missions, as Tucker documents it, is not a triumphant, victorious march of conquerors planting flags.
It is an agonizing, desperate crawl plagued by tropical disease, martyrdom, psychological breakdowns, and intense interpersonal conflict among the missionaries themselves.
They fought with each other constantly.
Let's look at the raw reality of some of these lives. Adoniram and Ann Judson were America's first foreign missionaries.
They went to Burma in the early 19th century.
During the Anglo-Burmese War, Adoniram was accused of being a spy by the Burmese government and was thrown into a literal death prison called Ledmanyun.
The conditions were horrific. He was bound in heavy iron chains, crammed in a sweltering, windowless room with dozens of other men, the stench of disease everywhere.
They would hoist him up by his feet at night so only his shoulders touched the ground.
Meanwhile, his wife Anne, who was pregnant, desperately lobbied the local officials for his release.
Bringing him smuggled food, living in a shack outside the prison walls.
They eventually lost multiple children to disease, and Anne herself died shortly after his release.
The physical and emotional costs they paid just to translate the Burmese Bible and establish a tiny handful of believers was absolute devastation.
And we see a different kind of toll in the 20th century with Bob Pierce, the founder of World Vision.
He famously prayed, "Let my heart be broken with the things that break the heart of God."
He traveled the globe, raising millions for orphans and refugees, becoming a legend in humanitarian aid.
Yet, Tucker reveals the dark side of that relentless drive. His personal life was an absolute tragedy.
He neglected his own wife and children for the sake of the global mission.
The stress and his own abrasive personality led to extreme family conflict, which eventually contributed to the tragic suicide of his eldest daughter.
He literally broke his own family while trying to heal the world.
It's heartbreaking. It forces you to ask, is the mission worth the family?
And then there's Helen Roseveare, a brilliant British medical doctor serving in the Congo in the mid-20th century.
During the Simba Rebellion in 1964, the hospital where she worked was overrun by rebel forces.
She was taken captive and endured horrific trauma, including brutal beatings and rape.
Yet she survived, and she eventually went back. But she became known later in life not just for surviving, but for her incredibly raw, uncomfortable honesty about her own personal spiritual failures.
She wrote openly about her intense pride, her arrogance toward other missionaries, and her constant struggle to trust God.
Even wanting to be seen as a savior herself.
Roseveare perfectly embodies the theology of the cross. She didn't emerge from that trauma with the shiny, superficial victory narrative where everything was neatly resolved.
She emerged scarred, deeply aware of her own profound weakness and ego, yet still bearing witness to God's grace.
We see a different kind of extreme, unconventional sacrifice in Jackie Pullinger. She was a young British woman who went to Hong Kong in the 1960s.
She operated as a Lone Ranger missionary. She didn't have a big mission board supporting her. She just walked straight into the infamous walled city of Kowloon.
The walled city is legendary. It was this massive, lawless, densely packed high-rise slum controlled entirely by the triad gangs.
Riddled with prostitution and ravaged by opium and heroin addiction, the police wouldn't even go inside.
But Pullinger went in. She set up youth clubs and started taking in hardcore heroin addicts.
And her methodology was wild. She didn't have methadone clinics or advanced medical rehab.
She relied on intense, charismatic prayer. She taught gang members to pray in the Spirit, speaking in tongues as a physiological and spiritual anchor to endure the agonizing physical withdrawals of kicking heroin cold turkey.
And remarkably, dozens of hardened triad members were completely transformed and freed from addiction.
And we can't talk about the cost without mentioning Nate Saint, the brilliant pilot for Mission Aviation Fellowship in the 1950s.
He was trying to reach the Wodani tribe, often called the Aucas, in the deep Amazon of Ecuador.
They were an unreached, highly aggressive, isolated group.
Saint developed this incredible aeronautical maneuver called the bucket drop.
He figured out that if he flew his small plane in a tight pylon turn, a bucket tied to a long rope would eventually lose its centrifugal force and hang perfectly stationary in the center of the circle right over a clearing in the jungle.
It was a stroke of technical genius. It allowed them to safely lower gifts, machetes, kettles to the Wodani.
And eventually the Wodani tied a parrot to the line as a gift back.
He used all his technical brilliance to bridge the gap. But despite months of this friendly exchange, when Saint and 4 other missionaries finally landed on a riverbank to make face-to-face contact in 1956.
They were all speared to death by the tribesmen.
Which ironically became the catalyst for a massive surge in missionary recruits globally.
The story was featured in Life magazine, and it inspired a whole generation. But to your point, These stories prove that the cross isn't just a theological metaphor in Wright's book.
It is the brutal physical reality of Tucker's history.
I want to offer an analogy here. Reading Tucker's biographies is like reading the raw, unedited, tear-stained diaries of historical heroes, rather than reading their polished corporate PR releases.
We see their severe depression, their arrogance, their strategic blunders, and their shattered families.
And honestly, it proves that God's perfect mission doesn't require perfect people.
Which, if you think about it, is both incredibly comforting because it means God can use us despite our messes, and utterly terrifying because it shows what the actual cost of being used might be.
That is profoundly true, and the culmination of all this flawed, costly, agonizing human effort over the last 2 millennia has resulted in something that no one in the 19th century could have predicted.
It has resulted in a massive, unexpected demographic shift, which brings us to our final exploration, the global reversal of Christianity.
Wright's theology culminates in the grand eschatological vision found in the book of Revelation, specifically Revelation chapter 7.
Eschatological, for our listeners, just refers to the ultimate end-of-history climax.
John's vision is of a great multitude that no one could count, from every nation, tribe, people, and language standing before the throne.
It is a vision of all nations gathered, sharing the identity of God's people.
And Tucker documents how the 20th and 21st centuries have actually realized this shift historically.
The so-called younger churches of the non-Western world have completely taken over the leadership of global evangelization.
If we connect this back to where we started, the Abrahamic promise in Genesis 12, that Abraham's seed would be a blessing to all nations, it has literally come full circle.
For centuries, the mission field was conceived in a very unidirectional way, the West to the rest.
White Europeans and Americans traveling on boats to Africa, Asia, and Latin America.
But today, the demographic center of gravity has shifted entirely to the global South.
The former mission fields are now the primary centers of missionaries. African, Asian, and Latin American Christians are driving the Missio Dei.
Tucker highlights Pandita Ramabai as an early, brilliant indicator of this shift.
She was an Indian woman from a high-caste, scholarly Hindu background in the late 19th century.
After converting to Christianity, she didn't just join a Western mission agency. She utilized faith mission models to evangelize her own country,
creating a massive compound for destitute child widows and orphans called Mukti.
She translated the Bible into Marathi herself. She wasn't relying on Westerners to come do the work. She was India, reaching Indians, leading the charge herself.
And then you have this profound paradigm shift brought about by Leslie Newbigin. We really need to dive deep into his story because it flips everything on its head.
Newbigin was a British missiologist and theologian who spent 35 years serving as a bishop in India, starting in the 1930s.
He saw vibrant, growing indigenous churches. He was deeply embedded in Indian culture. But then in the 1970s, he retired and returned home to England.
And he experiences massive reverse culture shock.
Exactly. He looks around his own home country, a country that had historically sent thousands of missionaries around the world. And he is shocked by what he sees.
He sees empty cathedrals. He sees a society completely unmoored from its Christian heritage.
He shockingly declared that the West itself had become a foreign mission field. And not just any mission field, but the hardest mission field in the world.
He argued that Europe was now dominated by a tough, resilient form of what he called modern secular paganism.
It was a post-Christian society that thought it had already tried and outgrown the gospel.
He basically said, we don't need to send missionaries out anymore. We need missionaries from the global South to come here to re-evangelize us.
That must have been a bitter pill for Western churches to swallow.
And Orlando Costas, a brilliant Latin American missiologist, took that critique even further. He harshly critiqued the alliance between Western mission work and economic imperialism.
He viewed the United States as a major unreached mission field, not a Christian nation, but a nation captive to the idolatry of materialism, consumerism, and military power.
He called for Third World Christians to bring the pure, prophetic gospel back to the West, to save it from its own idols.
He was essentially telling Americans, you are the ones who need saving now.
This demographic and philosophical shift was also mirrored in a massive shift in strategy, championed by people like Ralph Winter.
In 1974, at the Lausanne Congress, Winter shocked the mission establishment by arguing that we need to stop looking at geographic nation-states.
He said the mission isn't about crossing political borders on a map, it's about crossing cultural and linguistic boundaries.
Right, because a country like India isn't just one culture, it's thousands of distinct ethnic groups.
Exactly. Winter coined the term unreached people groups.
He relied heavily on sociological and linguistic data to target the remaining pockets of humanity that had no viable, indigenous self-reproducing church.
The focus shifted entirely from sending missionaries to countries to engaging ethno-linguistic groups, no matter where they lived.
So I want to address you, the listener, directly here as we wrap up this massive narrative. Think about the implications of this for your own life.
If you live in the West, in North America, Europe, Australia, you are now living in the mission field.
The traditional, stereotypical image of a missionary, a white Western expatriate wearing a pith helmet hacking through the jungle, is dead.
Both Wright's theology and Tucker's history completely dismantle it.
The blueprint has been exported, the demographic center has shifted, and the new contractors from the global south are building the next phase of the project in our own backyards.
It's a profound historical reversal, but it perfectly matches the theological trajectory Wright lays out.
The Missio Dei is truly from everywhere to everywhere.
So what does this all mean as we samesize this deep dive?
We started with a blueprint and a muddy construction site.
Christopher J.H. writes, "The mission of God provides the perfect divine blueprint."
It is holistic, encompassing the political, economic, social, and spiritual realms.
It is cross-centered, demanding ultimate agonizing sacrifice.
And it is global, aiming for that final eschatological gathering of all nations.
And Ruth A. Tucker's From Jerusalem to Irian Jaya shows us the messy, flawed, yet undeniably beautiful reality of the ordinary humans trying to build it.
From Paul's tent-making in the Roman Agora to Boniface's swinging axe in the German forest.
From Las Casas's political advocacy against the empire to Gladys Aylward's foot inspections in the mountains.
And from the Judsons' freezing prison chains to the modern, explosive rise of the Global South Church.
It is a history of immense failure, tragic blind spots, and breathtaking, terrifying courage.
Which leaves us with a final provocative thought for you to mull over.
It's a paradigm shift derived directly from Wright's text. Usually when we approach these topics or when we open the Bible, we ask a very consumer-driven Western question.
How can I apply the Bible to my life?
We treat our individual life as the main story, the main movie, and the Bible is just an accessory or a self-help manual we consult.
But if God's grand mission, the Missio Dei, stretching from Abraham to the end of time, is the ultimate driving reality of the universe, the far better question is this.
How can I apply my life to the Bible?
Where does your small, ordinary, deeply flawed life fit into this massive, ongoing, messy construction project of the Missio Dei?
The blueprint is perfect. The contractors are a mess, but the building is going up.